The day after the iron hunger left Cathra, the air felt lighter, as if the planet itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Villagers moved through the market streets with renewed energy. Traders unpacked their goods, and the caravans once again loaded their supplies of grain, meats, and spices. Yet, something deeper had changed, for the gathering on the plains had drawn not only humans and aliens, but travelers from systems far beyond, and each of them carried the story home. The tale grew in the telling a story of how a war nearly reignited but was stopped not by weapons but by the hiss of monstrous bacon and the glow of molten gold cheese melting under the morning sun. Within weeks, the leaders of dozens of worlds convened on a neutral station orbiting a quiet moon. They did not arrive under the banner of treaties or political alliances, but under the emblem of the cooking slab, a simple design engraved with steam curling upward. The meeting was unlike any before it, for there was no central table for debate. Instead, the slabs were set in a great circle, each one manned by cooks from different worlds. Some were humans, some were aliens, some from species that had never before shared a meal with either group. The air filled with the mingling scents of hundreds of breakfasts, each one unique, yet bound together by the same shared purpose. The commanders stood beside Thrix, watching as warriors, diplomats, merchants, and farmers walked from slab to slab, tasting, talking, and laughing. The sound was strange in such a place where the cold edge of politics usually ruled. Here, the only deals being struck were in the form of recipes and ingredients exchanges. The commander said nothing, but Thrix could see the satisfaction in the way his stance eased and his eyes followed the movement of the crowd. It was there, on that moon, that the first Interstellar Breakfast Pact was born, not in the form of a document to be signed and sealed, but as a promise spoken openly by every participant, that no matter what conflicts might arise, there would always be a place where enemies could meet over a meal before the first shot was fired. The promise spread faster than law, carried in songs, stories, and the irresistible scent of food cooking. In the early hours, months later, breakfast slabs became common sights not only in markets and caravans but in the heart of military camps on both sides of disputed borders. Soldiers would wake to the smell of sizzling and wander toward the heat, setting aside their weapons for the time it took to eat and speak. Sometimes these moments ended with battle, but more often they ended with an agreement to meet again at the slab. And so it was that across the galaxy, the sight of smoke curling into a pale dawn became a signal not of destruction but of possibility. Each hiss of bacon, each crackle of heat, each slow pour of coffee was a reminder of the day. Two enemies chose to eat instead of fight, and in doing so began something stronger than any victory they had known. The breakfast ritual had crossed the stars, and no one could say where it might end, only that, as long as the slabs kept sizzling, there would always be hope for peace. Weeks passed after the night on the desolate plain, and whispers spread that the iron hunger had vanished into the void. Yet Thrix knew better, for factions like theirs did not dissolve, they only waited and gathered strength. The caravans kept moving, the slabs kept sizzling, and the peace held. But there was a tension in the air, like the heaviness before a storm. The commander traveled less now, choosing to remain on Kethra, where the first breakfast had been shared, perhaps knowing that if the iron hunger returned, they would come. Here it was dawn when the sky split with fire as dozens of black ships descended over the plains. Their hulls were scarred and jagged, their engines screaming as they cut through the thin clouds. The people of Kethra scrambled to hide their children and guard their stores, but the commander did not move to evacuate. Instead, he stepped into the open field, where a single cooking slab stood ready. Beside it stood Thrix, his armor dulled from years of use, but his eyes sharp with determination. Around them, villagers, soldiers, traders, and even travelers from distant worlds gathered, drawn not by orders but by the pull of something they could not name. The ships landed in a semicircle, kicking up dust that hung in the air. The leader of the iron hunger emerged, chains draped over his shoulders, his expression carved from stone. He spoke loud enough for all to hear, declaring that this was the day the weakness of breakfast would end, that the galaxy would remember its true nature as a place where the strong ruled and the weak were consumed. His words were met with silence, save for the faint hiss of the slab heating in the cool morning air. Without a word, the commander placed strips of monstrous bacon onto the slab, their edges curling and spitting as the smell rose into the wind. He added thick slices of golden cheese and pancakes that browned slowly under the heat. The leader of the iron hunger scoffed, calling it a trick, a distraction. But even as he spoke, his own warriors shifted uneasily. The scent moved through the crowd, slipping past armor and resolve. Wrapping around every thought like a slow, relentless tide, Thrick stepped forward, breaking the silence. He spoke not of peace or war, but of survival, reminding the Iron Hunger that in all their battles, they still needed to eat. That hunger united them long before weapons divided them. He gestured to the slab where the commander flipped the bacon with practiced ease, the molten gold cheese stretching like sunlight caught in motion. The crowd breathed as one waiting to see if the moment would break or hold. Then it happened. One of the younger Iron Hunger fighters stepped out of formation, his chains clinking as he approached. He took a plate without speaking, bit into it, and closed his eyes as if tasting something he had been searching for all his life. The leader's glare faltered, another fighter followed, and then another, until the smell and the taste and the heat from the slab drowned out the call to war. The chains rattled one final time as the leader turned away, leaving the field to the hiss and crackle of breakfast. Peace had spread far, but not all welcomed it, and in the shadows of the outer rim, a faction rose that called itself the Iron Hunger. They claimed that war was the natural state of the galaxy, that to share meals with enemies was to invite weakness into the heart of every warrior. Their ships bore no markings of origin, only the blackened steel plates of scavenged armor, and their crews were made of deserters, outcasts, and those who had lost power. In the quiet of peace they struck not for territory, but to disrupt the caravans of food, and to destroy the cooking slabs that had become the symbols of this fragile unit. Trix heard of them first in a small settlement where the morning air should have been rich with the smell of sizzling monstrous bacon. Instead there was only the acrid scent of smoke and burned metal. The villagers told him the Iron Hunger had come at night, smashing the slabs, stealing the grain, and leaving behind messages carved into walls declaring that war would return. Soon Thrix felt the old fire in his chest, but it was not the fire of battle-lust, it was the fire of defiance. He joined a group of humans and aliens who had once fought side by side on Kethra together. They formed a caravan, not of trade but of restoration, carrying new slabs and fresh supplies to the places the Iron Hunger had struck. Their journey took them through dangerous routes, and they traveled with constant vigilance. But each time they rebuilt a slab and lit the heat, they made sure to invite every soul nearby to the first meal. The smell would rise, the sound of sizzling filling the air, and for a while even the fear faded, replaced by the pull of shared hunger. The commander too was drawn into the conflict, though he did not seek it. The Iron Hunger ambushed him on a desolate plain surrounding his camp with silent ships that blocked the light of the twin moons. Their leader stepped forward, a towering figure wrapped in chains that rattled with each movement. He accused the commander of betraying his own kind, of bending the knee to the Deathworlders, and of turning the art of war into a circus of flavors. The commander did not answer with words. Instead he reached into his pack and pulled out the slab, placing it between them. Without a hint of fear the leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the plain, but the commander only began to cook. The hiss of bacon cut through the cold night air, the scent drifting into the nostrils of the Iron Hunger warriors who stood tense in their armor. One by one they shifted their weight, their eyes following the movement of his claws as he turned the strips, the molten gold cheese beginning to melt beside them. No one moved to attack. The leader's chains stopped rattling. Whether it was hunger, curiosity, or something deeper, none could say. But before the night ended, even the warriors of the Iron Hunger were seated around the slab, eating in silence, and though the war they dreamed of still lingered in their hearts, they left without striking a blow, and the scent of that meal followed them long after the moons had set. The shared breakfast on the neutral world had been only the beginning, for once the seed was planted, it grew in ways neither species could have predicted. Caravans began to travel between human and alien territories, not under banners of conquest, but carrying sacks of grain, cured meats, strange spices, and brewing equipment, guarded not by armed escorts, but by volunteers from both sides who had once stood as enemies. Now they walked together, sharing stories and recipes as they crossed borders that had been soaked in blood. Only cycles before Thrix found himself part of one such caravan, traveling through the scorched valleys of Kethra, where the war had first brought them together. The air was hot and dry, but the scent of food followed them, carried in sealed containers to be revealed only when they stopped to make camp. The alien warriors in his group had begun adapting the Deathworlder meal to their own tastes, using native meats and roots, blending them with human techniques, until the sizzling monstrous bacon was joined by curling strips of crimson jungle vine and thick slices of spore bread that steamed from within. The humans responded in kind, adding alien spice powders to their coffee, giving the bitter drink a sharp edge that made their eyes water and their hearts race. Villages along the way, the sight of humans and aliens working side by side at a cooking slab, drew curious crowds. At first the watchers stayed back suspicious, unsure if the peace would hold, but the smell always reached them, and curiosity always won over fear. Soon villagers came forward bringing their own ingredients, a pouch of ground nut from a human farmer, a jar of fermented moonflower paste from an alien elder. The slab became a place where strangers became familiar, and familiar became trusted. The commander traveled, though not with caravans. He moved alone, visiting worlds, still on the brink of conflict. His presence was enough to draw attention, but it was the small, cooking slab he carried on his back that left the deepest impression. He would set it up in the open call for both sides to join, and then begin the ritual that had ended his own war. The scent would rise, the hiss would echo across the tense silence, and one by one, soldiers would lay down their weapons, if only for the span of a meal. He never spoke of diplomacy or alliances, but more than one battlefield saw its last day. Because of his quiet work, the legend grew into something larger than the truth, as legends often do. Some claimed the Deathworlder breakfast could make an enemy forget why they fought. Others swore it contained ingredients that healed old wounds. Some even whispered that it was a test sent by ancient powers to see if the galaxy was ready to survive without tearing itself apart. Whatever the reason, the ritual spread from planet to planet until it became a shared tradition, not tied to any single species or army, but belonging to all who understood its meaning. So in a galaxy, still vast and dangerous, there were places where the scent of sizzling monstrous bacon drifted through the morning air over camps and cities and farmlands, carrying with it the memory of the day two enemies chose to eat together instead of fight, and in that choice found a different kind of victory. Word of the battlefield breakfast spread faster than any report or transmission, leaping across the networks of both species, carried by warriors, traders, and wandering storytellers. The tale was always the same, a meeting of enemies who laid down their weapons not for surrender, but for sizzling monstrous bacon and molten gold cheese wrapped in soft grained discs. Some versions added that the twin suns shone brighter that morning. Others swore the ground itself warmed under the shared meal. But all agreed that something fundamental had changed on the Deathworlder home front. The story was told in mess halls and barracks, as a reminder that victory did not always come through fire and steel, but sometimes through the stubborn act of living. Well, even under threat, soldiers who had never left their homeworld began experimenting with their rations, melting cheese over fried meat or brewing the bitter dark liquid in the field, just to see if it might one day sway an enemy. The tradition became a quiet symbol of defiance, an unspoken promise that no matter the odds there would always be time for breakfast among the alien warriors. The change was stranger, more subtle, and far more profound. Their kind had long held that the first meal, after waking, was a purely functional act, fuel for the body, nothing more. But those who had tasted the Deathworlder feast began to speak of it differently. They described flavors as if they were colors, and textures as if they were landscapes. The language of battle reports began to shift, peppered with comparisons to sizzling, or sweetness, or the warmth of grain pressed by heat. Whole units began requesting captured cooking slabs as trophies, not to display but to use in quiet morning gatherings. Before patrol, the commander himself returned to his people not as a conqueror, but as a figure of mystery. He said little of the battle, but he carried with him a small metal pot, dented from use, and a pouch of dark grounds from which he brewed the bitter drink each dawn. His rivals mocked him at first, calling him softened, but when they tried the drink and the food that followed, they found themselves speaking less of war and more of moments worth preserving. Some even began to view the death not just as enemies but as a strange mirror reflecting their own survival instincts in a different light. Months later, on a neutral world under a sky filled with the lights of three moons, humans and aliens gathered at a long table, the air thick with the smell of bacon, pancakes, eggs and coffee. No treaties were signed, and no speeches were made. There was only the clatter of utensils, the hiss of meat on hot iron, and the quiet, satisfied sounds of beings who knew they were sharing something far more lasting than a document on paper. For a few hours, the galaxy felt smaller, kinder, bound together, not by shared bloodlines or histories, but by the primal truth that a good meal could end even the longest war. And as the twin suns rose again, somewhere far from that table, the smell of breakfast drifted over another battlefield, carrying with it the chance that enemies might one day become guests. The commander stood alone now, his warriors scattered among the Deathworlders, sharing in the ritual, his authority crumbling like brittle stone beneath the tide of scent and sound. He gripped his plasma halberd so tightly the metal groaned under the strain, but his gaze never left the slab. The heat shimmered in the air between him and the humans, and every sizzle of the monstrous bacon sent a ripple through his resolve. He had fought in 100 wars, crushed armies under his command, and faced weapons capable of scouring entire continents, yet nothing had ever broken his control like this one of his lieutenants. A tall warrior with scarred armor approached, holding in his claws a strange round stack, dripping with molten gold and glistening with grease. He spoke softly, urging his commander to try it, his tone carrying something close to reverence. The commander snarled, refusing to be undone by food, but the scent pressed into his mind like an invading force, searching for weaknesses. It wrapped around his thoughts, seeping into the cracks of his discipline, until he could no longer separate the memory of his homeworld. Dawned from the smoke rising off the slab. The humans said nothing. They did not mock him, or challenge him. They simply continued their work, turning strips of bacon with easy grace, flipping pancakes, letting rivers of syrup glisten in the light. Their calm was worse than any battle tactic, for it left no enemy to strike, only an invitation that gnawed at his pride. He watched Thrix laughing beside a human soldier, the two clinking their containers of dark, bitter liquid before drinking deeply, and the sound was so alien, it twisted in his chest like a knife. Slowly, the commander stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath his heavy boots. Each step brought the scent sharper and the heat warmer, until the battlefield around him seemed to dissolve into the glow of the slab. The humans made space for him without a word, one sliding a plate forward. The creation upon it was taller than the others, thick layers of bacon, cheese, eggs, and pancake discs all fused together. In a towering monument to excess and survival, steam curled upward, carrying the full force of its challenge. He stood still for a long moment, his claws hovering over the plate, his breathing loud in his own ears. His mind screamed of traps, of chemical lures, of psychological warfare, perfected to enslave the will, but his body betrayed him. His claws closed around the plate, and the weight surprised him, heavy yet balanced like a weapon, meant for both hands. He lifted it and without ceremony bit down. The taste detonated in his skull, his vision blurred, his knees locked, the salt and smoke and sweetness cascading through him like a flood breaking through a dam. He did not understand the flavors, yet he understood their message. This was not sustenance alone, it was proof of survival, proof that Deathworlders faced a hostile universe every day and still had the audacity to feast like kings in the shadow of war. When he finished, there was silence, not from shock but from respect. The humans nodded, the aliens stood taller, and for the first time the commander let his halberd fall to the ground, its weight unneeded in this new, unspoken alliance formed not by blood or treaty, but by the power of breakfast. The first alien to cross the line stood frozen, the scent wrapping around him like a living thing, the heat from the slab licking at the edges of his armor. The humans watched without fear, their movements calm, as they placed another strip of sizzling, monstrous bacon on the hot surface, letting it curl and pop like some creature still alive. The alien's mandibles twitched, his breathing heavy and uneven. The commander shouted again, but the sound carried no authority, now only the hollow echo of a leader who had lost the moment. The human nearest to the slab lifted the golden stacked creation and extended it toward the aliens. Their hands met for a fraction of a heartbeat, flesh to armor, the gesture so casual it felt almost like an invitation to an ancient bond. The alien hesitated, his multiple eyes darting between the offering and the warriors still frozen behind him. Then, without warning, he tilted his head back and tore into the creation with a sound that silenced even the battlefield's distant winds. The first bite hit him like a shockwave, the salt and smoke from the bacon fused with the molten gold of the cheese. The warm, grainy disc below soaking with flavor. He could not name. His body tensed, every muscle unsure whether to reject or embrace the sensation, but instinct overpowered doubt. His second bite came faster, and his third even faster, until the creation was gone, leaving his hands empty and his mind full of chaos. He stood there, breathing hard, his armor shifting with the rise and fall of his chest, as if he had run a great distance. Warriors behind him began to move now, one at first, then two, then five, breaking formation and stepping forward, their weapons hanging useless at their sides. The commander barked orders in a voice that cracked under the weight of disbelief, but his soldiers no longer listened. They were locked on the slab and the humans who worked it, as though the war they had been born to fight had never existed. The humans did not speak their language, yet somehow they communicated through motion and scent and sound. Each new alien who approached received a portion of the strange feast, and each one who tasted it changed in subtle ways. Their shoulders dropped, their eyes lost the hard gleam of battle, their stance softened like metal pulled from the forge. The bitter dark liquid followed the food handed out in dented metal containers, steam curling upward into the sky. The aliens sniffed at it cautiously before daring a sip, and when they drank their eyes widened in unison, as if lightning had flashed behind their skulls. Soon, the line between the two forces was gone entirely. The slab hissed and popped under the growing pile of bacon and golden cheese while pancakes rose and flipped in perfect arcs. The air thickened with heat, and the scent of indulgence and laughter began to mingle with the crackle of the slab. Thrix found himself shoulder to shoulder with a human soldier passing plates to others who only an hour ago had been enemies. He realized with a strange clarity that the war had not ended with a treaty or a battle. It had ended with breakfast, and there was no going back. The first bite came like a declaration of war, though the Deathworlders did not raise their weapons nor did they shout. Instead they leaned forward and sank their blunt teeth into the stacked creation, tearing through the sizzling monstrous bacon. With a sound that echoed in the still air, the aliens flinched as one, their senses overwhelmed by the crunch followed by the soft, muffled groan of satisfaction from the human warrior. It was not the groan of pain nor victory, but something else, entirely something primal that resonated deep within the chest, like the drumbeats of an ancient Huntrix tried to speak, but his mandibles clicked uselessly, the words caught between disbelief and a strange rising hunger. He saw the molten yellow substance stretch and snap between the human's jaws, its sheen catching the light of the twin suns like gold fresh from the furnace. The scent grew even stronger as the air carried the heat toward them. It clung to their armor, their skin, their thoughts. The younger warriors began to shift uneasily, some loosening their grips on their weapons, others leaning forward ever so slightly as though drawn by invisible threads. The commander's many eyes narrowed, and for the first time since landing on this cursed death world, there was uncertainty in his stance. He had studied their enemy, extensively learned of their resilience, their capacity for violence, their strange ability to endure toxic environments and brutal climates, but this was not, in any report, this was not a weapon, as the warriors understood weapons. This was something older and more dangerous, something that could break an army without firing a single shot. Another human approached the slab and poured a dark liquid from a battered metal pot into small open containers, steam rising in twisting patterns that danced in the light. The smell was sharp and bitter, and it struck the aliens with the force of a plasma burst. They had smelled stimulants before on the battlefields of Varrock and in the trenches of Gorth, but this was different. This was focused and commanding, like a general's voice calling soldiers to rise from their sleep. The Deathworlders lifted the containers to their mouths and drank without hesitation, felt his hearts beating faster, the rhythm pounding against his ribs. His vision narrowed until all he could see was the movement of hands bringing food to mouths, tearing, chewing, swallowing, every action deliberate and without fear. He realized then that the Deathworlders were not just eating, they were performing a ritual of dominance. They were showing that even in the presence of armed enemies, they could feast as though seated at their own hearths, on their own homeworld. One warrior, in the back of the formation, dropped his weapon entirely, letting it clatter on the cracked soil. His claws flexed, and his breathing quickened. He took one step forward, then another as though hypnotized by the sound, and sent the commander barked an order. But it was too late. The first alien crossed the invisible line between the two forces, not to attack but to stand at the edge of the slab, staring at the sizzling monstrous bacon and the molten gold. Between the layers the humans did not flinch, they only smiled and slid a portion across the slab toward the newcomer. The war was no longer about territory or resources. It was about who could face the ritual of the Deathworlder breakfast and remain unchanged. The alien warriors stood on the dusty plains of Kethra, their silver armor gleaming faintly under the pale light of the twin suns, their weapons held ready for the inevitable clash with the Deathworlders. The air smelled faintly of ozone and scorched metal from the wreckage of the previous night's skirmish, and the ground beneath their clawed feet was cracked and brittle from the heat. They had fought countless enemies across the stars, from the ice beasts of Drath to the acid-breath serpents of Rixel, but nothing in all their campaigns had prepared them for the sight before them now. The Deathworlders moved with calm precision, their strange cloth armor hanging loose, and their faces relaxed. They were not fortifying defenses or sharpening weapons. Instead, they had gathered around a crude black iron slab that hissed and spat as heat rose from it. On that slab lay strips of something that sizzled furiously, releasing waves of scent so powerful it cut through the warriors' helmets, and burned into their minds. It was a smell unlike anything they had known, a mix of smoky salt and something deep and primal that tugged at instincts they did not understand. One of the younger warriors, Thrix, shifted uncomfortably, his grip on his plasma halberd tightening. He whispered to his commander in their clicking guttural tongue, asking if the Deathworlders were preparing chemical weapons. But the commander did not answer. His multiple eyes were fixed on the slab where a human flipped the strips over with casual precision, letting the glistening edges crackle and curl. As they turned, the strips revealed a rich, deep red fading to a dark, crisped brown, a transformation so alien, and yet so mesmerizing that none of the warriors could look away. The Deathworlders laughed softly among themselves, speaking in low tones as they worked. The sound was casual, unafraid, as though the presence of armed alien soldiers meant nothing to them. Soon more strange items appeared, round shapes that hissed when placed on the slab, releasing another wave of scent that seemed to punch the warriors in their chests. It was sharp and warm and somehow alive, and it mingled with the first smell until the air was thick with it. The warriors' mandibles twitched involuntarily, some from hunger, others from confusion. Thrix felt something in his chest, an odd sensation, like the first surge of battle adrenaline, but it was not fear and it was not rage. It was something far more unsettling, a pull toward the source of the smell. His training screamed that this was a trick, some kind of sensory warfare meant to disorient them. But another part of him, the ancient part that had survived before there were ships or weapons, whispered that whatever was on that slab was meant to be consumed. The Deathworlders began to place the strips and the round shapes onto flat discs made of grain, pressing them together, stacking them, adding thick, molten yellow slabs that oozed as they melted. The sight was hypnotic. The alien warriors did not advance, they did not speak, they simply stood there, frozen in the heat and the smell, watching the Deathworlders feast on sizzling monstrous bacon, as if the battlefield had been transformed into some strange, sacred ritual.